So this was supposed to be an easy series, it really was. The idea was quite simple. I would, using a wonderful book I have by Ray Sturviant, called The Squadrons of the Fleet Era. It's a good book. I would be able to do the Royal Navy sections, the Royal Navy squadrons in this year's Year Aircraft Carrier, nice and easy, nice and quickly. And they provide a once a month video which I wasn't going to have to be super perfectionist over, because I already had perfection to start off from, or very close hard work to work from as a basis. The trouble is, I have two problems with that. One of them is that I am a perfectionist. Not always in so much as managing to get the sound right. I do my level best, but somehow whenever I upload it to YouTube, the truncating that YouTube puts the video through means that what sounds perfectly fine, normal volumes on about, and comes out perfectly clearly on my video on my computer at about roughly 40% of volume, and I can hear it over all sorts of things, doesn't then work so well through YouTube. Still not quite sure why that happens. Working on that one. And then, of course, you have the problem occasionally with my ability to pronounce foreign languages. That's always weird. But pretty much comes down to many, many, many issues in my education. We'll leave that to one side. But even with all that included, I still thought, yeah, these are not going to be complicated for me to put together and to my standard. I like these squadrons. I've spent a lot of time in these squadrons. I actually spent time with 848 Squadron, who were another jungler unit that were stood up, and basically they stand up and get dropped down depending on when they're needed, but usually they are stood up to cover for 845 in transition. So when 845 is being transitioned between types, to maintain overall fleet capability, they stand up 848, and they're a training squadron and do a sort of things. And I spent time with them. I spent time with 824 Squadron. These are squadrons I have a close affinity with. I really enjoyed my time with them. They were really good people. And I got to meet a lot of people, and I've met a lot of people over the years from 845 Squadron. But that also makes it more difficult in a way, because that means in these videos I'm trying to not just capture their history and give you a discussion of their history and their purpose, but also their character. See, 845 is a squadron that starts out as a strike ASW squadron, reconnaissance squadron, with the motto Audio Hostem, which means I hear the enemy. They still have that motto today, but they are more commonly known as the Junglies, because they are Commando Helicopter Force Specialists. They fly the big helicopters, whether Sea Kings or Merlins or, well, a few other aircraft over the years, and are really crucial to the capability of us to project for the Royal Navy, to project to the Royal Marines ashore where they need to be. They've also been critical to operations in Afghanistan and all sorts of places around the world. This squadron has shown up, and they're named the Junglies. Where does that come from? That comes from all sorts of operations in jungle warfare, surprisingly enough, to be called the Junglies. I've also personally seen them get altitude sickness when they fly higher than, I don't know, 4 inches off the ground. They are, par excellence, probably the best terrain following helicopter pilots I have ever watched fly with my own eyes. I have heard of others who are just as good and who are better. I haven't seen them in person. The 845 Squadron, 848 Squadron, 846 Squadron, I have been lucky enough to see in person do it. And frankly, they truly do have to live the meme of they have to go up to be able to deploy their undercarriage. They are that cool. They are that capable. And they probably don't have to worry about high voltage wires, because I don't think they're ever flying high enough to run into them. They are, without a doubt, some of the best insertion, extraction, troop transport pilots and aircraft and aircrew and fitters and maintainers and basically squadron team in the world. And I'm not saying that because I'm being rude about anyone else. I'm really not. But I've seen them work. And I have seen some very good American units work as well. I've been very lucky in my life to see them. And they were really, really good. Please don't get me wrong. When you're talking about this level, the differences you're making are pretty much judgment calls because they are that close. But I would say 845, just a slight edge. Maybe the Americans are slightly less scared of altitude. Who knows? But definitely a very, very good squadron. And I'm hoping I will be able to capture some of their esprit de corps, some of their culture into this video. So far, the version which was scheduled to go up on the 21st, I didn't like. It was my 4th attempt to get it right, and, well, I just didn't feel it was up to it, really. It didn't get it enough. So, let's try again. Now, in all my videos, I tend to have a shameless book plug. Why? Well, I'm a British naval historian. I like the idea of being a university lecturer. I do it quite often as a contract lecturer, but I'd like a permanent post. And in the UK, the only way you can get such a post is by being well known through book publishing. Doesn't matter how famous you are on YouTube, doesn't matter how famous you are on TV, doesn't matter any other criteria you can put forward. They care about how well you do with journal articles and how well you do with books, because those are what come up when their government's awarding funding for research. So, how do you advertise books? Well, I can't really afford to do advertising, pay for advertising. Publishers don't pay for advertising these days, it seems. So, or at least their budgets are minuscule, probably because, honestly, the profit margins aren't that massive, judging by how much they pay the authors. So, yeah, I do it myself. I do the shameless book plug. This is my book about travels, battles, and darings. There are more books to come. But I will say this for the YouTube channel. Thank you to everyone who likes, shares, and subscribes to videos. Thank you to everyone who does super chat, super thanks, all those things. Thank you to everyone who's a patron, does a Ko-fi, or is a member of the channel. That money all goes to buying more books which underpin the channel. And it also goes to the Iron Brew supply, which also helps keep the channel going. Let's be honest. And currently, as you can tell from the box behind me, in the process of moving house. So, yeah, pretty much any money gratefully received. And, even worse, even though I've been eligible to be hired for sponsored videos for well over a month now, Iron Brew still has not contacted me. This is reprehensible on part of their marketing team. How have they not realised that me, with these lovely dulcet tones, is their perfect marketing tool? Send me Iron Brew. I don't even need cash money. Just send the Iron Brew, and I will quite happily talk about you. I drink you in pretty much every video anyway, so just send the Iron Brew. We'll call it quits, or rather evens. Until I run out again, then you can send more. Isn't this the winning face? Send Iron Brew. Anyway, to 845 Squadron, who I will say do have some last time I was there, some really, really nice snacks in the vending machines. Really nice snacks. Anyway, Torpedo Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron, TBRS. That is what they originally formed as. And originally they get the Grum Avenger, because that's what these squadrons formed at a point at which the Fleet Air Arm, Royal Naval Air Service, was rapidly expanding. Well, they have a bit of an interesting starting point, because you see, whilst the squadron's personnel were formed up at Lyon-Solent, they actually got their aircraft in New York. And that's where they did their first qualification training on Avenger 1s. Then they brought them back and they took an active part in World War II from that point onwards. And when I say active part in that war from there at that point onwards. They really did, including getting out to Malaya. And that's important because the Far East, as it's termed in British terminology at the time, Southeast Asia, will be a massive part of the squadron's history. But honestly, this squadron, as much as I would love to say their history forms them from the very beginning, their can-do attitude is inoculated at this point, and that certainly becomes part of the squadron ethos early on, and is something which is associated with the badge, with the motto, with the duty of it. That's not really when the squadron identity becomes. It's the same in their second sort of period, because their first period lasts till 1955, realistically. And then they are formed up, and they have helicopters. They do all sorts of duties with these, anti-submarine warfare, but also the developing points of lift. These helicopters, of course, are Western Whirlwinds. They start off with HAS-22s, then move to getting some HAR-3s, and eventually HAS-7s. So they have a really interesting anti-submarine warfare, but also doing some troop lift background, and some really interesting troop lift service. Including, let's be honest, ferrying the Royal Marines ashore from HMS Theseus during the Suez Crisis. Yes, they were there. They were there showing the world, this is how you can do a helicopter insertion of personnel. And they did it well. They did it really well. But that's not, though, when they come of age. That's during, well, when they earn the title Junglies. It starts off in the Brunei Rebellion in 1962. December 1962. And that's when they're really first deployed and first sort of operating with troops, inserting, recovering them, supporting them in jungle warfare. And, well, it carries on because they then get suckered into, well, the British get suckered into the Indonesian-Malaysian confrontation, or the Borneo confrontation, or sometimes the Konfrontasi, as it's sometimes known in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. It lasts from 63 to 66, and pretty much it's all about the Indonesian opposition to the creation of Malaysia, and especially the Federation sort of movement from moving from the Federation of Malaysia to Malaysia itself, and the way it was going to be. What a modern Malaysia is I would call it a federated set of states, but it's Malaysia. Although technically it's a federal constitutional monarchy, which is comprised of 13 states and the 3 federal territories. It's interesting. Let's just leave it as it's very interesting, and it's something which probably would require an entire video of itself to explain the Malaysian political system and their changeover from the Federation of Malaya to that sort of portion of Malaysia, and why the Indonesians were quite so against it, and why it only ends when the Indonesian president, Sukarno, is deposed in 1966. The thing is, though, for all these operations, the ability to insert and recover troops, to support troops, to truly make sure those troops were okay, was critical. Now, if we go to Sturviant's book, it writes this, because it never does much on any section of their history, but it does do quite well. Now, this on number 845 Squadron, next reformed at Codros on the 10th of April. They're now based at Yeovil, at Yoltons, an air station, rather than Codros. That's the one in Cornwall versus the one. They're now based at the one in Somerset, not the one in Cornwall. Number 845 Squadron, next reformed in Codros on the 10th of April 1962, as a commando squadron with 12 Wessex HAS-1s. These embarked in HMS Albion in September, sailing in her to the Far East in November. On arrival, the squadrons were quickly involved in action against the Indonesian guerrillas operating in Brunei, a task which it was to perform for the next 2.5 years, transferring to HMS Bulwark when HMS Albion sailed home in February 1964. 3 Hiller HT-2s were added in April 1964, and the occasional Whirlwind HAS-7 was also flown, but these had all been withdrawn by the time the squadron sailed home to the United Kingdom in September 1965. To be presented with the 1964 Boyd Trophy Award for Outstanding Defence Work in Malaysia. Interesting enough, they win that trophy an awful lot. They truly do. And that, by the way, is named for Captain, later Admiral Boyd, and it goes to the squadron or pilots or unit which have demonstrated the most aviation excellence in any particular year. It's a very prestigious award, which honestly I would say not enough is done to really publicise it and publicise the winners of it. It's one of my ideas of a book someday to write, is the history of the Boyd Award and all the reasons why different squadrons have won it. I think it'll be a really interesting read. I just think that's another one on the part list of books which I have to get round to at some point when I'm no longer moving house. In terms of Brunei, the forces involved that they were supporting included 40 Commando, 42 Commando, Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, the 29th Commando Light Regiment Royal Artillery, Queen's Own Highlanders, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, 1st Green Jackets, of course the SAS and other formations, the Gurkhas, 1st and 2nd Gurkhas and 1st and 7th Gurkhas. Good units, good hard-fighting infantry units, but they needed a strategic mobility. When we're talking about the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, well, that gets even more involved. And for that, 845 really does a lot of work. Now, one of the reasons they do so much work is they are the worked-up unit. And what do I mean by worked-up unit? Well, when we're talking about commissioning a ship, and a ship being commissioned, usually you've done its testing beforehand, etc., and it's commissioned. And there's a period after it's commissioned where you spend quite a lot of time training the crew, making sure they're fully worked up. i.e. proficient with their systems, proficient with their doctrine, proficient with everything they need to be to operate. In the UK, that usually involves them spending doing a spell of time with the flag officer sea training, and basically getting, well, I could say put through their paces, but having witnessed a couple of the exercises over the years and the experiences they put them through, I'd say it borders on torture, but it's all done in a very professional way. Basically, the idea is to make it as close to a real war scenario, but most of the scenarios are closer to the Kobayashi Maru than they are to necessarily a winnable operation. But they do it as tough as they can, so they can train them as well as they can be. It's the same with squadrons. It's the same with any air group. It's one of the reasons why when you talk about carriers in World War II and you go, why is this carrier not being used? And you go, and the answer usually is, well, are there aircraft? Is there a wing worked up for it? And that just means not just trained pilots with aircraft that we know work, but trained pilots who've worked with their aircraft, who've done all their flying training, who've worked off a carrier, who've worked up. Are they actually available? Is there actually a working unit, a viable working unit available? Now, this is the thing about 845. For a lot of this period, they are the viable working unit. And there's nothing wrong with being that, but it does mean they get a lot of work, because they are the first to set up, they are the first to be focused this way. So they, of course, get the most work. They were key to facilitating the troops in being on patrol the areas of jungle. Often, as you can see here, embarking, disembarking them in, we're going to call them basic clearings, but let's be honest, they had a little bit more luxurious space than other organizations would when they're doing similar operations in places of the parts of the world not too far away from where we're talking about in general regional scenarios. They were relieved in 1965 by 848 Squadron. They returned to Cold Rose. They re-equipped with the new twin-turbine HU-5 Wessex. And then they returned to Borneo. So they were the first Junglies out there, and they were the last. They turned up with their Wessex Has-1s, and then they finished out with their HU-5s. And basically it's HMS Bulwark, the LPH, converted light fleet carrier, which embarks B-Flight in October 1966, which was them leaving. They did a huge amount of operational work. At one point, they were providing 75% of the aviation cover. This is not because there were not good RAF units there. There were good RAF units there and other Navy units. But one of the advantages it was found that the Junglies of 845 had over their RAF counterparts was that they were pretty darn good at getting supplies off anyone and pretty darn good at keeping their aircraft to a very high level of maintenance on a very thin logistics string. One of the interesting things about the RAF is, whilst they hadn't gone full Cold War yet at this point, they're already heading down the line, which would see them become less and less mobile as they become used to more and more operating from the bases. And they had to. For the Cold War period, that was actually essential to what they were being built up for and their work in Europe and their path in that sphere. But the trouble is, you get so structured around working from a secure supply line, a massive base with massive depot, your systems don't fit when you're deployed to an extreme position. And luckily, the Royal Navy systems, which were designed around aircraft carrier operations, which can be a more interesting supply scenario on occasion, did give them an advantage. Now, they get up to a lot of fun things in this period. Afterwards, they get up to a lot of fun things, but they also do a lot of hard things. Fun things would be they have the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, flew with them for a while. But hard things, 845 at one point was the first squadron to be established as part of a rolling presence of the Commander Helicopter Force. We're going to keep it to its modern name because that just makes life easier. In Northern Ireland. And the idea was that you would have each squadron, etc., involved would share the role of having a detachment on a 6 weeks of rulement there. So 6 week deployment. So not a ongoing deployment of the whole squadron or anything like that, but they'd have 6 weeks out there and then they'd come back and they'd be replaced by another group. At one point, 845 not only were proving their reputation for all weathers, all times, they would come get you. No matter what the situation, they would come get you. Something which they'd earned when they'd earned the title of Junglies over Malaya. No, they also stacked up quite an interesting record. In one particular month, and they came close to this in about 5 other months in their times out there, they flew 80% of all the support helicopter tasks hours, but only were providing 30% of the aviation assets as theoretically available on the table. And again, that was put down to one part their reputation, so people were requesting them. Okay? You know this. You know all these units are good. You know all those units are good. You've trained with them all. But one unit has a reputation of doing the impossible. You're going to request that unit first. You're not going to be too worried about which unit get assigned, but you're going to request that unit first. And if they're free, they're going to come. But also, they have a great reputation for also for maintenance and for making sure their helicopters were available and were operational, which really, again, helps things. They didn't always have a good time. they didn't always have a safe time. When they were doing various operations aboard Bulwark, there was a fire, and a marine engineering mechanic actually died in that fire, and this is in 1971. They took part in Operation Exit, which was the withdrawal from Malta, in 72. Basically, HMS Bulwark sits in the Grand Harbour for roughly 11 weeks, and, well, 845 fly a little over 1,000 missions. And that was, of course, when Prince Charles was serving with them. Around that time, anyway. Unsurprisingly, when the Falklands came, they were straight in there. They're one of the units. Look, here's one of the interesting things. When you talk to Michael Clarke, who was the Commodore of Amphibious Task Group, he will tell you his principal assets that he felt he brought to the table to support the Marines and to carry out the delivery's missions of delivering the Marines' 3rd Commander Brigade and sustaining them, supporting them in operations, were fearless and intrepid, obviously. The LCUs, the LCVPs, I had landing craft utilities, the big ones, the LCVPs, the landing craft vehicle personnel, and the commando helicopters. It's one of the reasons why in a lot of exercises he trained with the commando carrier, HMS Hermes, being assigned to him. This is the fun of the Falklands War. The reason why Fearless and Intrepid didn't have hangars, the reason why Albion and Bulwark don't have hangars. Justification was used, well, there's going to be a proper aviation asset available, so you don't need a hangar for your helicopters. Of course, HMS Hermes got quickly used in a primary Harrier role, which she needed to be because they needed the air defense assets and they needed the strike support and all the facilities which those extra Harrier aircraft brought with them. HMS Ocean, of course, is now gone. She was a focused LP at landing platform helicopter. And now we have Prince of Wales and Queen Elizabeth, which are wonderful ships. They really are wonderful aircraft carriers. And they are very, very good strike carriers. They're Vistal carriers. I know some people have reservations about that, but actually they made perfect sense in terms of the timing and in terms of what Britain wanted out of them, but also in terms of what was planned to come next, to come with them, for a contiguous operational force, which would make sense. That seems to be less and less likely delivered upon, those extra things. The idea of replacing Albion and Bulwark with LHDs, that's landing platform helicopter docks, which of course usually have a full-length flight deck and the ability to operate Vistal aircraft. But you don't know. The vessel which is going to carry out our future amphibious operations in the UK is still under development. Still being... We're not sure which type. We know we're going to get something, but we're not sure which option we're going with. We just know we're not now going with the Dutch option, which we were going to do because it was too small for what the British wanted. The reality is, it's normal. It's normal for the British Armed Forces to find themselves having to not relearn lessons because they often remember the lessons, but to have to pay again while the politicians relearn the lessons, which they learnt 20 years ago, because they forget. And it's the same for many democracies. During the Falklands War, one of the things you do see is that 845 are still using the HU-5, the Wessex HU-5, while 846 had upgraded to the Sea King HC-4. And one of the things that's worthwhile noting is that during the war, the Sea Kings of 846 flew over 2,800 hours. They completed 10,000 individual troop moves, or thereabouts, and transported more than 81,600 tons of freight. That was during the Falklands War, operating from HMS Hermes. 845, well, they have all their crews recalled from Ireland on the 4th of May on 24 hours notice to go. They recall everything they have operating. They were still maintaining the island patrol. Whilst they're doing that, some have already started massing to depart for the South Atlantic with the rest of the task force. They were tasked with resupplying the convoy while passing the Ascension Islands and getting the supplies from the Ascension to the task forces, to the various supply ships. They inserted the Special Air Service into South Georgia, which of course assisted with its recapture. And then they are probably the only squadron which outflies 846. But that is actually an up for debate, because, let me put it this way, both squadrons were far more concerned with flying the missions and doing what was needed to be done, and moving the freight which was needed to be moved, than they were with necessarily keeping 100% accurate records over exactly how many personnel were jammed in the back of them, and exactly how many hours they were flying. They keep very good records. This is one of the interesting things about the Falklands War. The Royal Navy does keep to some very hefty engineering maintenance standards. They keep to it, and they keep up all the operating hours as well, showing that it can be done, that these standards can be maintained. But one of the advantages of keeping to such tight standards, one of the advantages of not throwing away the maintenance standards that you would keep to in peacetime, and the sort of, we're going to perform this maintenance routine at this many hours of usage, etc. Well, that means the aircraft availability is going to be pretty high. And with the aircraft availability being so high, they really rocked and rolled them. And during the Falklands War, especially when you don't have the Chinooks, they get lost, of course, when the Atlantic Conveyor gets hit. You have one Chinook trying to do as much effort as it can. Well, it's all the Commando transport aircraft which really take up the slack. And eventually some of the anti-submarine warfare Sea Kings as well come in to help. Mainly they have to do it because the Sea King can carry slightly more than the Western Wessex. And despite 845's best attempt to try and figure out a way to carry even more from their helicopters, it was useful when you're dependent upon helicopter logistics to have as many helicopters as possible. Because this is the dirty little secret of logistics. However many ships, however many helicopters, however many trucks your peacetime simulation says you're going to need, when it comes to war, you'll always need more. It's not just because of the attrition of the enemy, it's just because of the way things happen in war. It's because you can be sending your supplies all to one place, and then suddenly the front collapses and you're moving forward, or suddenly the front collapses and you're moving backwards and you have to get those supplies out of there because they're vital and the enemy can't have them. War is just not nice. No one ever said it was going to be. A phrase which this channel comes back to often is the Duke of Wellington's phrase, Sir Arthur Wellesley's phrase. There is nothing... The only thing more terrible than a battle won is a battle lost. The only thing worse than a war won is a war lost. And anyone who tries to say it can be done nicely, they don't know what they're talking about. The Sea King HC4 era. Some of the most famous operations you will have heard about. Or probably not heard about, depending on how current you are with Royal Navy and British Armed Forces operational names. Operation Granby, that's a pretty darn cool one, which was the operations in 1991 for the First Gulf War. And this is really interesting because it's really the first time that 845 really gets to spend a lot of time in the desert. Up until that point, they'd been a jungle Arctic party force. That's where they go. It's either very sweaty and tree, or very snowy, rocky, and mountainy. Admittedly, the Arctic tundra is, to an extent, quite close to a desert in so many ways. But it's not the same. And they do well. They do really well. And in between all of this, they keep returning to Northern Ireland. They keep carrying on doing those operations. They took part in Yugoslavia. They took part in supporting UN Profor and NATO, various peacekeeping missions they were there for. They provided transportation for soldiers, for generals and admirals and air marshals. They provided civilian movement. They provided refugee evacuation, casualty evacuation. They did it all. These helicopters turned up every time they were asked, and they did what they were asked. And once again, rather as with Brunei and Malaya, 845 were the first squadron into Bosnia, first British helicopter squadron into Bosnia, and they were the last to leave in 2005. There's a little bit of a tradition turning up here, isn't it? First in, last out, and it carries on. They were deployed to Afghanistan almost as soon as Operation Oracle was started. They are part of the British commitments to Sierra Leone in 2000, and in 2003 they took the first troops into Iraq, starting the assault on the Al-Faw Peninsula. They then alternated between Iraq and Afghanistan, operating for pretty much in one or the other for the next 20-odd years. Now, during that time, believe it or not, they transitioned over. They changed to the Augusta Westland Merlin. First, some HC-3As, which were good helicopters. Let's be honest, they were kind of a quick buy because the Royal Navy was running short of airframes for its Merlin fleet. And again, that's because the British government had done a nice little analysis and gone, this is the minimum number of airframes which will meet our needs. So that's all we need to buy, because there's going to be nothing we can't predict coming down the road. I mean, it's like every single government likes to believe it has a crystal ball. And when I say every single government, please note again, this is not just the British government I'm talking about. It's pretty much every government in history that's ever made that case. Every government in history has ever made a case of, no, we're sure we can go with a minimum because we're sure we know what's going to happen in the future, has been shown to be absolutely wrong. Usually within short order, but usually they get shown to be wrong in the short term, shown to be desperately long in the medium term, and catastrophically wrong in the long term. And that goes for pretty much anyone who ever says, oh, we can get rid completely of that capability. We don't need to have the ability to do what that thing does. No, you usually need to find something else which can do that, because otherwise you're in trouble. They got the HC-3As originally from the Danish for the Royal Air Force to operate. And then they are transferred in about 2012 from the Royal Air Force to the Royal Navy. Pretty much the Royal Navy has upgraded most of these aircraft to the HC4 standard, which is also what they've converted their other Commando Merlins, which were from the Royal Navy's batch, into. So this is now the stand. This was the H3C, this is the HC4, no, the HC3 and HC4. There are so many letters. I apologise when I get them wrong. There are just so many letters. In fact, they've all been at HC4 standard since roughly mid to late 2022. So for the last couple of years, they've been at their highest standard. And they are good aircraft. They are very useful and very capable assets. They are certainly something which the Royal Navy would love to have had in terms of the lift capability back in the Falklands War, and as you can see, they even have a tail ramp, which is all to their advantage. And they're continuing on the same missions as they've always done. They are, wherever the Royal Marines go, wherever the British are operating troops from the sea, are supporting these operations, that's where you're going to find them. You're going to find 845, you're going to find 846, their sister squadron, and 847. And that's one of the reasons why they are going to be assigned, and have been assigned, to the Joint Expeditionary Force Maritime, which is the new structure which the British are really pushing for their future operations and how they're going to be organising things. But realistically, the name doesn't matter. The name of the organising force doesn't matter. The title given to the commodores and admirals in charge doesn't matter. They are, well, as long as there's some command structure there, and it works, that's fine. Its branding doesn't matter. What matters is the units it has at its disposal, and what matters is much of the equipment that they have is the history of those units and the standards their personnel hold themselves to. One of the reasons why 845, 846, and 847 and 848, those 4 squadrons so associated with the Royal Navy's amphibious warfare strength, have always held themselves to such a high standard, is because that's always been demanded of them. And because they've always achieved it, they expect it on themselves. It's an interesting thing to work around and work with, because you see, you can walk into some organizations where everyone works overtime as a standard because the the people in charge, the company, expects it, and that's the only way you're going to show off and get ahead. One of the interesting things I found whenever I've been around these units is that if it's not necessary, if there's nothing requiring it, that's fine. But if work needs to get done, they'll put in the hours to get the work done. No one needs to ask. No one makes a statement. No one goes, "You will need to do overtime." No, they will just get it done. The clock is there, but that's someone else's problem. This needs to be done. They have a consistent can-do attitude and a consistent history of delivering, because that's what they've done, and now that's what they expect themselves to do, so that is what they have done again. And the more they do it, the more their unit's history is one of accomplishing these feats, the more they hold themselves to the standard of accomplishing it. They do what needs to be done. If you ask for them, if you call for them, they will find a way. Or there won't be a way possible. That's their legacy. That's what they've delivered through their history in the Royal Navy. I hope I did it justice, really. So, what have we got coming tomorrow? Next week, we've got the conception, operation, conclusion of the Shikoku class. That'll be fun. And then we're into June. where the premieres begin. Woohoo! And at some point I go moving. Wish me luck. Oh, this is going to be fun. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Thank you for your support. It wouldn't be possible to do this channel without it, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked the video, please do consider liking, sharing, subscribing, all the things along here. And, well, if you want to support the book habit that underpins it all, Patreon, Ko-fi, Super Chats, Super Thanks, memberships, all appreciated. Thank you very much, and I hope you had a good time. Oh, and one more thing. I always finish these videos with a question. So I'm going to put forward a question which I was at a conference a few years asking and answering. Attempting to, anyway. There's been a lot of discussions over the years, and I did actually put a paper, I think I'll put on Global Maritime History, or my old Amphibious Necessity blog on Blogspot. I cannot remember which one it was on. But anyway. We were talking about the future of rotary aviation in naval operations. And my view is, you could theoretically make anti-submarine warfare uncrewed. You could make airborne early warning uncrewed. You could certainly make reconnaissance uncrewed. You might well have crewed aircraft as well, but they could be sort of acting as force enablers for the uncrewed aircraft, sort of coordinating them and keeping it so it's even further away from the ship that they're running off. But my view has always been this. Troop transports, if anything is going to stay crewed in terms of having a human at the flying controls, it's going to be troop transport aircraft. They might be optionally crewed. There might be helicopter airframes which can be flown by the computer, but the moment you put commandos, troops, people's lives in that aircraft, and depending on that aircraft staying airborne, my view has always been it's going to stay crewed. And I'd love to hear what you think, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. Thank you very much. Take care.